Thank you for watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. Please make sure to visit our website and check out our premium courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Arnold, V-Ray, Maxwell, motion graphics, and much more. And also please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Vimeo to enjoy our free video tutorials. In this lesson, we talk about Irradiance Map and we'll see how it works in theory, and we'll try to create a GI solution for our simple and complex scenes. And finally, we'll see what are its strengths and weaknesses. Get ready for a very long lesson. The key difference between Irradiance Map and brute force is the fact that in Irradiance Map, instead of computing GI for all the shaded points that are visible to the camera, GI will only be computed at some points and interpolated for others. Let's open up our render settings, enable GI, and set Irradiance Map as your primary engine, and set the secondary engine to none. And as you can see, there is no Irradiance Map in the secondary engines. That's because it only can be used as the primary engine. Let's open up our frame buffer and see how Irradiance Map works. Let me hide the history panel and have my render settings window also open besides the frame buffer. The camera is roughly here in the scene. As it is a view-dependent method, the first rays are shot from the camera into the scene to determine the placement of the GI samples. Now, remember, unlike brute force, we wouldn't have one sample at each shaded point or at each pixel. The samples will be created for only some points in the scene. Pay a very close attention to these terms that I'm using, because unless you really want to understand how Irradiance Map works and how those parameters are going to help you come to a better GI solution, you really need to focus and pay attention. Okay, so when one of these rays hits a surface, a GI sample will be created. From these points, the hemispherical burst of GI rays will be traced into the scene to gather information. And the number of these rays is controlled by the hemispherical subdivisions parameter, which is sometimes called just subdivisions or subdivs parameter. Obviously, more rays equals to a higher quality GI solution. So when you increase this number, you're going to get a higher quality GI solution. The quality of samples are going to get increased. Okay, now that we have the GI solution for some of the points in the scene, what about the points that weren't lucky enough to get any GI samples? Now, for those points, V-Ray takes some of the already calculated samples from around that point and interpolates between them and averages them out to come out to a solution for that point. And the same thing will happen for the other unsampled points in the scene. And like before, if we have a secondary GI engine enabled, when a GI ray hits a surface, the secondary engine tries to bounce that ray in the scene. One essential thing you need to know about Irradiance Map is that it's produced in several passes. What I mean by that is, let's say in the first pass, the samples are created all over the place in a random fashion. In that first pass, Irradiance Map tries to assess the scene and see where are the details in the scene. In the next passes, in each pass, it tries to add more samples to more detailed and more complex parts of the scene. We will visualize that in a few moments. Now, let me close my frame buffer and get back to the render settings. In the anti-aliasing tab, enable use local subdivs. I won't mess around with image sampler settings just to avoid any confusion here. Okay, In the Options tab, make sure Don't Render Final Image is disabled. If this is enabled, only the GI will be calculated and V-Ray wouldn't render the final image. In the Multipass Manager, I have lighting and GI added as well. Also, I'm going to select my light and increase its subdivision to 64 so we wouldn't get any noticeable noise from our direct lighting. Below the V-Ray tabs, click on this section a few times to change the interface to Expert so you can see all the options. And let me set my current preset to medium and take a render and see what we get without changing anything else. I mentioned that Irradiance Map is created in several passes. Now, based on our settings, we are using 3 passes to generate the Irradiance Map. In the Advanced Options section, let's enable Mixed Resolution so you can actually see those passes. We can decrease or increase the number of these passes very simply. In the first pass, it tries to get an idea of the scene, and in the following passes, it adds more and more samples to the detailed areas. And after these passes are calculated, we start to render our final image. This is our first render, and as you can see, it took about a minute, which is very quick, and we have a fairly clean GI solution. And if I go to the GI pass, you can see it's clean, even though it might lack some details compared to a brute force. These noises are actually coming from the light, but to increase the speed of these renders, I didn't increase the light subdivisions that much, so these noises are coming from our direct lighting. Now let's close our frame buffer and start explaining Irradiance Map parameters. The first and most important Irradiance Map parameters are mean rate and max rate. Remember, we mentioned Irradiance Map is created in several passes, and each pass adds more samples to the more detailed areas. Not only we can control the number of these passes using mean rate and max rate, but we can also control the resolution at which those GI passes are being calculated. Right now, mean rate is set to -3 and max rate is set to -1. That means we have 3 passes, -3, -2, and -1. If I change my mean rate to -4, now we are going to have 4 passes, -4, -3, -2, and -1. And if, let's say, max rate is set to 1, now we will be having 6 passes, -4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and +1. And with each pass, we'll add more samples to the detailed areas. Now let's set the mean rate to -3 and max rate to 0. Mean rate determines the resolution of the first GI pass, the one with the least amount of detail. If mean rate set to 0, this pass would have the same resolution of the final image that you are having. If set to -1, it would have half of the final image and half of the final image resolution, and so on. So when set to something like -3, we are using a very low resolution to calculate the first GI pass, and this pass would be good enough for large, flat, even areas. And as we go through the other passes, we increase the resolution twice each time and add more samples to the detailed areas. And max rate determines the resolution of the final GI pass. Now let's see that in action. Make sure Show Calculation phase is enabled so we can see these passes. Now when we will render, you notice that in the first pass the samples are very random, and with each new pass we focus more on detailed areas. In this case, let's set the max rate to 0 and open up our frame buffer, and let me clear the current render and start a render. Now the first pass is very quick and we randomly generate some samples in the camera view. In the second pass, which is twice the resolution of our previous pass, we only add more samples to the corners and smaller details. And in the third pass, we even pay more attention to those more detailed areas. And in the final pass, we barely add any samples to any flat areas and pay even more attention to the corners and complex intersections. So clearly, if you use a min rate of, let's say, 0 and max rate of 3, you're going to also have 4 passes. But those 4 passes are going to be having higher quality compared to, let's say, -3 and 0. So they would take more time to calculate, and at 1, when we're using the pass 1, for example, we are going to have double the resolution of the final image. But the right thing to do is to always set the min rate as a negative value so we can calculate less interesting and more flat, even areas very quickly. So the higher resolution passes would be used to calculate more complex areas. In the Options tab, make sure Don't Render Final Image is disabled. Now I have 2 renders to show you, one with the min and max rate set to -7 and -4, and the other one with min and max rate set to -3 and 0. In the lower quality renders, you can see tons of details are gone. Take a look at these legs down here, and if you compare it to our higher quality render, you can see the contact shadows are almost gone, and you can see that throughout the scene if you pay close attention. And you can also see some artifacts here and there. Now let's get back to our render settings. Next we have hemispherical subdivisions, which controls the number of primary GI rays. So the higher this number, the higher the quality of our GI samples. Let's render our scene with different subdivs number and see what we get. In the first render, subdivs was set to 1, and as you can see, we have an extremely splotchy render. That's because each sample can send only one ray, and the quality of those samples are going to be very low, and they are going to be very inaccurate. Now, in the second render, the subdivs was set to 4. So each sample can have up to 16 rays, and obviously the quality is a lot better compared to our previous render. In the next render, the subdiv was set to 10, and obviously the quality is a lot better. And you can also check out the GI passes and the RGB passes to see how they differ. Next we have 50. So we basically have a clean render. Now each sample can send out up to 2,500 rays into the scene. The averaging of all of those information is going to result in a much more accurate result compared to our previous renders. Now for such a simple scene, 50 would possibly be more than enough, but in more complex scenes we can increase these numbers, and in this case I have this render with the subdiv set to 200 here. As we increase the subdivs number, you notice the render time is also increasing. So basically calculating the Irradiance map passes are going to take longer because the samples sending a lot more rays as we increase the subdivs number, but also the quality is getting better. Next we have interpolation samples, which is the number of samples to interpolate the global illumination at a given point. You remember when I said that in Irradiance Map GI will be calculated only for some points. For those points without any GI samples, the GI will be calculated by interpolating and averaging the neighboring samples. Now the number of those samples is controlled by interpolation samples number, or interpolated samples number. To see how it works a bit better, let's decrease the subdiv number to 4 and render a few images with different interpolation samples. In the first render, the interpolation sample is set to 1, and as you can see, it's very blotchy. In the next render, it was set to 4, and we get blurrier results compared to the previous one because now we are using more samples to interpolate a given point. As I increase this value to 10, 20, and 80, you can see each time we get less splotchiness, more blurriness, and less detail in the scene. Next, I increased the subdivs to 50 and repeated the same process. Now, the individual samples are having a higher quality solution and they are more accurate. As we use lower interpolation values, the result is splotchy with more detail, and as we increase it, the result gets blurrier and less detailed. For example, if I compare the renders with interpolation set to 20 and 80, you can see in the 80 version we lose tons of details and contact shadows compared to the when the interpolation samples was 20. So as you can see, neither the low values nor the high values represent quality. You need to stay in between, and maybe something like 20 to 35 is an accepted range to be used as your interpolation sample. Now let's set the interpolation samples to 20 and continue with the rest of our parameters. The next option is use camera pass. If you have an animated camera in your scene and you want to calculate the irradiance map for the entire camera pass in one go, you can turn this option on. So whether a fly-through animation or an animation with moving objects can benefit from turning this option on, and it helps to reduce flickering in your animation. Next, we have interpolated or interpolation frames. As you can see, this option is grayed out and only works when the irradiance mode is set to animation. And as the name of this mode suggests, it can be used to render animations. Now, the interpolation frames number controls the number of adjacent frames to the current frame that their irradiance map will be interpolated to smooth out the final result and remove any possible flickering. So right now the interp frames is set to 2. So if we are, for example, rendering frame 10 in the animation, the irradiance map for frame 10 and 2 frames before that frame that are 8 and 9 and 2 frames after it, which are 11 and 12, will be interpolated. So in general, 5 frames will be interpolated when the value is set to 2. Also, the number of interpolation samples depends on this parameter. Right now, 5 frames will be interpolated, so the interpolation samples will be multiplied by this number. So the overall interpolation samples would be 100 to further smooth out the final result. If you want, you can, reduce the interpolation samples in that situation. Let me for now set the irradiance mode back to single frame. Next, we have show calculation phase, and as you know, if enabled, you can actually see the irradiance map pre-passes as it's being calculated before the final render. Next, we have show samples, and if enabled, the irradiance map samples are actually going to show up in the final render. Let me show you a render with this option enabled. Now, you can see all the GI samples that was added to the scene in different irradiance map passes. Then there is show direct light. It will show direct lighting for primary bounces in addition to indirect lighting while the irradiance map is being calculated. Generally, you really don't need to touch this option at all. Next, we have intensity threshold, normal threshold, and distance threshold. Intensity threshold controls the irradiance map sensitivity to indirect lighting. Distance threshold controls the sensitivity of irradiance map to distance between surfaces, and normal threshold controls the sensitivity of irradiance map to surface normals. For intensity and normal thresholds, the smaller the value, the more sensitive irradiance map will be, and therefore the final GI solution will be more accurate and detailed. But for distance threshold, higher values means more samples where the surfaces are close to each other. We still have show samples turned on, which is going to be very helpful in visualizing how these threshold parameters are working. In the first render, the color, normal, and distance threshold were set to 5, 5, and 0 respectively. You can see even though the max rate is set to 0 and we expect to have tons of samples in complex intersections, but as you can see, the algorithm does not pay any special attention to those areas and the samples are evenly distributed, because the algorithm is not that sensitive based off of the parameters that we set in our intensity, normal, and distance thresholds. In the next render, the thresholds are set to 1, 1, and 0, and we don't see much of an improvement compared to our previous renders because these numbers are still pretty huge. In the next one, thresholds were set to 0.5, 0.5, and 0.1. Now, as you can see, we get a lot more samples in those corners and intersections and detailed areas. And in the next render, the thresholds were set to 0.2, 0.1, and 0.3. And as you can see now, because V-Ray is a lot more sensitive, we get a lot more samples in those complex areas. Now let's make sure our intensity threshold is set to 0.4, normal is set to 0.2, and distance is set to 0.1. Now next we have detail enhancement group of parameters, and it's very useful. If you enable detail enhancement, you can use Irradiance Map to handle the GI solution for flatter and simpler areas, and you can use brute force method to calculate GI in more detailed areas of the scene. When you use detail enhancement, you can utilize lower Irradiance Map settings because Irradiance Map will only be used for even and simple parts of the scene. In this case, let's set our min rate to -4 and max rate to -3. And we can increase our interpolation samples to something like 50, as all the detailed areas of the scene will be calculated using brute force. Also, let's make sure show samples is off. Now let me show you two renders with and without detail enhancement. In the first render, detail enhancement is off, and as you can see, we don't get to keep any details in the scene, especially with the high interpolation samples number that we have. We smooth out every detail. Now the contact shadows are almost gone, and you can go throughout the scene and see this lack of details everywhere. In the next render, detail enhancement is enabled. And even though the render took almost twice as our previous render, we get all the details and contact shadows back. Now let me zoom in some areas and compare this render with our previous one. Also, if I select the GI pass, these differences are becoming very obvious. As you can see in our detail enhancement version, all the details are back, but now the noise problem that we had with brute force is back again. So let's see what we can do with it. To control the quality of the detailed enhanced areas, we have subdivision multiplier, and it is a percentage of the Irradiance Map subdivision. So right now our Irradiance Map subdiv is 50, and if I set the subdiv multiplier to 1, we're going to get all of those rays for the brute force calculations. And if set to, let's say, 0.5, we only use 50% of our Irradiance Map subdivision. Let's set it to 1 and maybe 5 and take a look at the resulting render. When set to 1, especially if we are in the global illumination pass, you can see not much of an improvement, but when set to 5, it's a lot cleaner, and we can clean the rest using our image sampler, but obviously the render time has increased. Next we have radius, which controls the radius for the enhancement effect. Then we have scale, which is the unit for the radius parameter. Scale is in pixel and world is in the world units. Turn off detail enhancement for now. And let me set the interpolation samples back to 20. Set the min rate to -3, max rate to 0, and threshold to 0.4, 0.2, and 0.1 respectively. Next we have randomized sample, which is on by default, and it jitters the samples randomly to prevent artifacts in the GI solution. First, let me enable show samples, and I can show you two renders with and without this option checked. When is off, you can see the samples are distributed in a grid on the scene, and when is on, the distribution is random, and normally this option should be on. Let's also disable show samples for now. Next we have mixed resolutions, and this is what gives us the ability to calculate Irradiance map in several passes. If disabled, the map will be calculated in one pass, and the resolution of which is specified by the max rate, and it's also a good idea to have this option on all the time. Then there is sample visibility, and it can be really helpful to prevent artifacts like light leak through thin objects. When the two sides of that surface are having a very different illumination. Now let's visualize that quickly. Let me create a small plane object. Rotate it 90 degrees and put it in front of the scene besides this shelf maybe. Now let's create a V-Ray area rectangle light and put it behind our plane. And let me also rotate it towards the bottom of the plane. Let's make sure the light is about 125 centimeters with an intensity of 50 watts, and a bluish color might work. To see the problem a bit better, let's set the min rate to -3, max rate to -2, and interpolated samples to 100. Now, let me show you two renders with and without check sample visibility on. Now, the placement of the light and the plane might be a bit different compared to this render, but it would be enough to prove the point. In the first render, check sample visibility as off, and as you can see, the light on the other side of the plane clearly leaks and affects where it's not supposed to. And the reason being is that the interpolation point in that leaky area is using bright samples from the other side of the plane. But in the next render, when check sample visibility is on, that point is only using samples that are visible to it, so the artifact is gone and we are having an accurate render. Also, as having this option on adds another layer of calculation and complexity, the render time has increased considerably compared to our previous render. In most cases, if you are having fairly decent Irradiance map settings, you wouldn't need check sample visibility to be on, and Irradiance map would have done a nice job of preventing those light leaks. For the next render, let's set the min rate to -3, max rate to 0, and interpolated samples to 20. If we render the scene, as you can see, we do not have any light leaks because the quality of our Irradiance map is decent enough, so we wouldn't need check sample visibility to be turned on. Okay, now let me delete this plane and the light, as we don't need them anymore. Next we have calc samples. This value shows the number of already calculated samples to guide the sampling process. Values between 10 to 25 usually works. Lower values speed up the rendering, but the final solution might not be quite accurate, and higher values make the sampling more accurate, but the render will be slower. And that was me quoting the V-Ray guide. Next we have interpolation type, and obviously from the name it appears that it relates to the interpolation samples value. Here you can choose the method for interpolating samples. The default is least square fit. First you have weighted average, which is simple and fast but normally causes blotchiness in the final solution. Least square fit, which is the default method. It's better than the previous one, but it's slower. The next one is the lone triangulation, and I hope it is the right pronunciation. And unlike the other ones that try to smooth the overall result, this tries to preserve the details, and the final results might look noisier compared to the other ones. And you would need to increase your Irradiance Map subdivs to get a noise-free render when using the lone triangulation as your interpolation method. Finally, we have least square with Voronoi weight, which is a modification of the least square fit method, and it tries to improve upon it, but up to now it hasn't been so successful, and you're better off using the least square fit method. Now, the two preferred methods here are least square feet and the lone triangulation. Least square feet is great for simpler scenes and the result will be smoother, and the triangulation method is suited for more complex and detailed scenes because it preserves the details and wouldn't smooth out the final results. But to get a noise-free render with this method, you would need high Irradiance Map settings. Now set the min rate to -4, max rate to -3, normal threshold to 0.3, and hemispherical subdivisions to 10. Now let me show you two renders with the interpolation method set to least square feet and the lone triangulation. Obviously, as I compared the two, you can see least square feet is smoothing out the results, and triangulation is preserving the details, and everything is sharp, but not quite in a good way. Okay, set the min rate to -3, max rate to -1, and hemispherical subdivisions to 50. Next we have sample lookup, and if I quote the VRAY guide, it is the method of choosing suitable points from the Irradiance map to be used as basis for the interpolation. And you really don't need to know how this works, and as you can see, there is a useful description for each of these methods from draft to fast, good, and best, and the default one, which is density based, is your best bet to get high quality renders. Next we have Irradiance Map modes. The first one is single frame, and in this mode one Irradiance map is calculated for the whole image and for each frame. So this is what we have been kind of working with. We are in the current frame. Let me go to frame 0, and if I go to my frame buffer and delete this current render, so basically we can also delete the history panel here. So there you go. So if I render the scene, you can see the Irradiance map will be created for each frame, and if we have an animation, it will be created for each frame like this, right? The next one is bucket mode, and in this mode, if I render the image, you can see a separate Irradiance map will be used for each of the buckets. So if I go to the bucket mode and start my render, you can see there is no pre-pass. Just for each bucket there is a pre-pass that's been calculated live and in real time, so there is no pre-pass for our Irradiance map. So we have the buckets mode, and another one that we have is obviously from file. You provide an Irradiance map file, and VRAY won't calculate Irradiance map again and uses the supplied map instead. Now let me show you how it works. So the way you set it up, you go, first of all, you need to make sure you are in the single frame mode, and down here you need to enable this autosave option and define where you want to save the file. So in this case, let's click on this browse button, and in the text folder for this chapter, let's name the file whatever. I'm gonna just name that IR map, right, for Irradiance map. I'm gonna save this. Now if you render your scene, let me just clean this. You don't have to do that, so just render the scene, and we got our Irradiance map. And one thing before actually rendering the scene, because we just, in this case, we just want to actually calculate our Irradiance map, and let me also set my secondary GI engine to light cache, so we also have the light cache in this case. Okay. Now, in this case, we don't want to render the final image. We just want to calculate our GI and then supply the map to basically for the final render. So the way you do it, you go to the option, you enable don't render the final image. So when you enable this, only the GI will be calculated. And now we are ready. We have our autosave and we have our light cache as our secondary engine. You don't have to have light cache. If you want to, you can just have a primary engine, but in this case, the normal thing we normally have is Irradiance Map and light cache. So now if you render your scene, what's going to happen is that you can see the light cache is being calculated, and then we have our Irradiance Map. And when the Irradiance Map calculation and prepass is done, the final image won't be rendered. Now you can the file has been saved in this path. Now you can go to the mode and change it to from file and actually supply the file. So let's go to our browse button. So I'm going to click on this and load it. And now if I render the scene, let me just clean this so you can actually see how it's happening a bit better. And if I render the scene, you can see we just have, what we can do right now is to actually disable our secondary engine, which is our light cache, because the light cache information is saved in this file. So we can actually turn off our secondary engine, and the file we just loaded, because we had our light cache enabled before rendering in the single frame mode, if you remember. Now the information in this map basically includes both the Irradiance map and light cache information, so we can turn off our light cache so it won't be calculated again. And if let me just clean this again and render the scene. Now, as you can see, let's see what's happening here. So we have our single frame, our Irradiance map set to none. We should be good to go. We have loaded our file from file, and one thing we forgot actually is to make sure we have our don't render final image disabled, because right now the VRAY won't allow the final image to be rendered. So we disable that, and if you render the scene again, you can see the final image will start immediately without having to go through the Irradiance map and light cache calculations. So there you have it. Okay. Now, another mode that we have here is this multi-frame incremental. Now, before going through this, let me just quickly create a simple camera animation. Let's change this to our constant shading line. So in our camera 01, let me go to 50 frame timeline and create a keyframe, go to frame 50, and let's, I don't know, move this to something like here. It doesn't have to be anything specific. So maybe something like this, okay? And set another keyframe. So we have this kind of simple fly through camera animation. Now, using basically the multi-frame incremental mode, let me just change this to this. VRAY will calculate a complete Irradiance map in the first frame, and from the next frame, VRAY uses that first Irradiance map as a base and adds to the map where there isn't enough detail. In our example, we can go ahead and render all the frames using multi-frame incremental, and only the first frame will get the complete Irradiance map calculation, and the other frames will use that map as a base and refine that map where it needs to be. Now let me show you how we can actually have our Irradiance map calculated for this fly-through animation without having any flickering. You can see in this case the motion isn't so extreme, so we can probably go ahead and calculate the Irradiance map for each 5 frame using the multi-frame incremental. And in this case, frame 0 will have the complete Irradiance map calculation, and in frame 5, for example, you can see just we barely move. So we use the map from frame 0 and we start to add to it where it needs to be. So we go to frame 10, we add a bit more information. Frame 15, we add a bit more information, and the in between frames can use the same irradiance map because the motion isn't so extreme and the data contain the irradiance map for all of those points too. So in this case, the way you do that, again, you first of all make sure you don't render final images enabled. And in the Irradiance map, you have the multi-frame incremental. You need to enable save multi-frame file and define where you want to save it. In the text map, let me just name it multi-frame or something like that and save this. You can see in this case, autosave is disabled, so you need to save it here. And then we have about 50 frames in our timeline. So we go to frame 0 to frame 15, our output. And as I mentioned, we need to maybe render each fifth frame. So in this case, we can set the frame step to something like 5. Now the Irradiance map will be calculated for every fifth frame. And in the indirect illumination, we need to have our light cache enabled again. So the data for the light cache will be calculated and saved as well. And I think we are good to go. So what we need to do is to actually render our animation and see what we're going to get. So let me render this. We don't need to save any file. But let's make sure we have our don't render final image enabled, which we do, and let's render the scene. So right now the light cache and irradiance map for the frame 0 is being calculated. After that we go to frame 5 and use the information from frame 0 and add to it. And as you can see, the irradiance map is being calculated much faster because it already uses the information from the frame 0. So we go to frame 10 and frame 15. As you can see, as we go through the scene, because we have all of the irradiance map information from our previous frames, the calculation becomes much faster because we already have those information. So we can skip a lot of places that are already having the irradiance map information. So it's probably gonna take a minute or two to calculate the irradiance map for the entire 50 frame animation that we have. We could have actually enabled use camera path for our irradiance map and for our light cache to have a better result, but in this case you can go ahead and enable it on your own and the result probably would be a bit better, but it doesn't matter because we're kind of focusing on the multi-frame incremental mode and the other irradiance map mode. So as you can see, okay, now we have finished our irradiance map and light cache calculation. And what we can do, let me just close this, go to my render setting. We have saved this data, right? So now we can actually change the mode to from file and load the multi-frame file that we have just saved, right? There you go. So I'm gonna load this. So we are in the from file mode. Make sure we have don't render final image disabled. Now we can actually go ahead and start rendering our final animation from frame 0 and frame 50, and we will be good if we render any frame in this timeline because we have the irradiance map for the entire scene in that one multi-frame incremental file that we have just saved. So let's say I want to render frame something like I don't know, let's say 18, or let's go to something like maybe 37. You can go ahead and render the entire animation, but in this case I can change this to something like current frame. So let's say frame 37, which looks good, and we can go ahead and render this, right? In this case, let's put the frame state back to 1, and we should have enough information to actually render this. As always, set the light cache to none because we already have the information from the light cache in this file. And if you go ahead and render the scene, you can see frame 37 will be rendered very, very quickly without calculating light cache or irradiance map because we already have those information saved. So you can render your animations in this way to get flicker free fly through animations, right? Okay, so that is nice. Next we have this add to currents map, And it's like multi-frame incremental, but in this mode, an entirely new map will be created at each frame and added to the resulting map of the previous frames. So let me quickly show you how this one works. If I go to my second camera, you can see if I select it also, in the first 4 frames from frame 0 to 3, we have 4 different views from 0, frame 1, frame 2, frame 3. Now let's see, it's a very complex interior scene and we want to render these 4 views. For each view, we need a complete Irradiance map information so we don't get any kind of flickering and artifacts. So as I mentioned, the add to currents map is precisely for a situation like this. In the first frame, an entirely new map will be created for this current view. In the next frame, another new map completely from scratch will be created for this new view and will be added to the map that we already have from frame 0. So now those 2 maps combined will give us one map that have the information to have a perfect render for both frame 0 and 1. So if I go to frame 2, the same thing will be again calculating an entire new map for this view, and we'll be adding it after it's done to our previous map that was the result of the first 2 frames, and that goes on. So the way you do it, it's just add to currents map. You can see it's like when it was set to from file mode, you come down to the autosave, and let's name this one add to currents map, or whatever you name it, right? You save it, and again you make sure the don't render final image is enabled. In the output we are only rendering 4 frames, so from frame 0 to 3. Make sure you have light cache is again enabled because you are trying to save the information from that too. And yeah, you should be good to go. Don't render final image, indirect elimination. Ooh, okay, so if you render the scene again, now what's gonna happen is again an Irradiance map file for the first frame from scratch. Then we go to the frame 2 with a new view, so a light cache and Irradiance map from scratch will be calculated and will be added to the previous frame. Our third view, and our fourth view. Great. So if I close my frame buffer, I can actually change the mode back to from file and load the add to current map, which is this one. So if I load this, you can name it whatever you want, so just doesn't have to be anything specific, the naming. So now we have this. So again, we turn off light cache, we turn off don't render final image, and now we are ready to render any of these views, and the result will be a beautiful complete map without having to go through calculating the Irradiance map and light cache again. So let's say I want to render frame 2, so just make sure in the output you also rendering the current frame, and so make sure also again. Okay, so if I render the scene, you can see the light cache. You don't need the light cache or Irradiance map calculation. You just start the final render, and because we already have the GI information for this frame, we don't need to calculate it again, and the final image will be calculated immediately and rendered immediately. And let's see, if I get back to my indirect illumination tab, we have this incremental add to current map, and in this mode V-Ray uses whatever Irradiance map in the memory and refine that from the first frame instead of calculating a completely new map from the first frame. We have the last two ones are the animation prepass and animation render, and When you have object animation in your scene, you need to use these modes. So if you are trying to render animation with object animation, you first need to change the mode to animation prepass. So when you set the mode to animation prepass, you define where you want to save the irradiance map for each of the frames in your timeline in the autosave section. In this mode, basically a separate irradiance map will be saved for each frame. So V-Ray asks you where to save the irradiance map for this animation in this autosave section. In this case, we have 50 frames, so 50 irradiance map will be saved and later reused. So you save it whenever you want and start rendering the entire timeline. And in this case, V-Ray is smart enough to only calculate the irradiance map and won't render the final image. After all of those frames are calculated, you can change the mode to animation render. Using this browse button, you can obviously define the files that you just saved and start rendering the final animation. And for each frame, V-Ray automatically will use its corresponding irradiance map without having to calculate it. So that's about irradiance map mode. Let me just change that to single frame again. Finally, we have this on render end section. You have this don't delete, and if you have it checked after you finished your render, the irradiance map from that render will stuck in the memory, and if you disable it, it will be removed after the render is done. And we have this autosave, and if enabled, you can specify a location, and each time a render is finished, that map will be automatically saved on your disk in the specified location, the irradiance map basically. So that's about Irradiance Map in VRAYforC4D. I will see you in the next lesson where we discuss light cache. Thank you for watching this free video tutorial from mographplus.com. Please make sure to visit our website and check out our premium courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Arnold, V-Ray, Maxwell, motion graphics, and much more. And also please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Vimeo to enjoy our free video tutorials.